Hi there. I'm going to show you how to use relative versus absolute referencing mode when you're recording a macro. So I'm here in the developer tab. I've got some data here and I've just put some random numbers in. I've copied and pasted this onto a second sheet just to make it easier when I start to make modifications. I can easily copy and paste back here. So let's go ahead and click into this cell, and right now it's in absolute referencing mode, which means it's going to record the absolute references, B5 and so on, that I click, and not the relative references. So let's go ahead and record a macro. So right now, start with B5, record a macro. So I name this absolute. Now what I'm going to do is the cell to the right, I'm going to make yellow, and the cell below it, I'm going to make bold. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete 3 columns over, which is column E. I'm going to right click on that column heading and do delete. Now I'm going to return the cursor, the active cell, back to B5. I'm going to go to developer and I'm going to stop recording. Now you notice if I go to Visual Basic and I open up the modules here, that we have the code there. So this is what the macro recorder recorded. This is the code. You notice that a lot of these things are absolute references, right? Range C5 is an absolute reference. B6. Column E is a absolute reference. So let's go back to Excel, and I'm going to just go back to my second sheet here. I'm going to copy and I'm going to paste, and let's test our macro. So let's put it back in B5, and let's go to our macros and run the absolute macro. You see it did exactly what we had wanted it to, right? It deleted column E and formatted those cells like we wanted. Now let's reset it once again, and now instead of starting in cell B5, I'm going to start maybe somewhere else before I run it. So I'm going to do macro absolute, we're going to run, and it does the exact same thing. It didn't start in the active cell, it would skip back to those absolute references, B5 and so on. So let's reset this once again, and we're going to record a macro in relative referencing mode. So I'm going to start with the cursor again in the active cell in B5. I'm going to click on use relative references. Let's go ahead and record a macro. Let's just call this relative, and do the same thing where in the cell to the right we're going to make yellow, the cell below we're going to make bold. I'm going to right click on column E and delete that, and then return the active cell to B5, and then we are going to stop recording. So let's first look at the code. We go here and you see that it has a sub relative, and everything here you don't see in terms of absolute references. You do see absolute references with respect to here, but it's always this, when you have a dot and then something, this is a sub property of a sub object of an object. So really this is offsetting the active cell by 3 columns, and then it's column AA of that active cell, which really corresponds to E in this case if we started in column B. So let's go back to Excel. I'm going to reset, control copy, I'm going to paste it here, and let's first make sure it works in B5. So we run the relative and it does the same thing. You see it deleted column E, and so it's working fine. But now if we start in a different active cell, so maybe I start down here at -4 and we run this, it does everything in terms of relative references. And you see instead of, so we have a 6 at the top there, instead of deleting column E, because we started in column C, it deleted 3 columns over, 1, 2, 3. All right, so that's sort of the difference between absolute and relative referencing. Now let's do one more thing. I'm going to do sort of a mixed referencing mode, because you can change the referencing mode during a recording. So let's go ahead and reset everything. I'm going to start in B5. Now this works, from my experience, it doesn't really work that well going from absolute to relative during a recording, but if you can go relative to absolute. So let's go ahead and start with B5, and I'm going to record a macro. Let's call this just mixed, and again, same thing. So we're going to highlight to the right, bolden the cell below it. Now I'm going to switch midway through the recording. I'm going to unclick that, and I'm going to right click on, so now we're in absolute referencing. I'm going to right click on E and delete that, and then let's go back to our cell here and let's stop the recording. If we go back to our Visual Basic editor, you see in our mixed macro, you see this active cell, this is a relative reference. This is a relative reference. But now we switch to absolute, and now we have an absolute references here and an absolute reference there. So instead of returning back to the original cell, it should return always to B5. It should always, instead of deleting 3 columns over like we did with the relative, it's always going to delete column E. So let's go ahead and see what happens when we run this. So control copy and paste, and now let's start here like we've been doing. Let's go ahead and run the mixed. So this should do exactly what we've been doing. So deleted column E. But now if we run this starting in a different cell, so for example C7, the first part of our mixed macro was run in relative referencing, so we should highlight D7, we should bolden C8, but then we switched into absolute, so we should, instead of deleting 3 columns over, 1, 2, 3, so we deleted this column with our relative referencing when we started on C7, we're going to delete column E because it's an absolute reference. So let's go to our macros and we're going to run the mixed, and that's exactly what happens. And instead of this active cell returning to the original cell when I recorded, because I was still in absolute referencing, it goes back to B5, which is what I had when I recorded. Alright, now you're going to have a quiz question on so you're starting here, and I'm going to record a macro. So watch the screen clipping, the video, and then I'm going to ask you which cell is highlighted yellow if I ran the macro starting with cell B3, and which cell is going to be bold.